Hello everyone and welcome to the lesson. The subject is auditing and assurance. Today we turn our attention to engagement letters for assurance and non-assurance engagements. Assurance and non-assurance engagement. Letters of engagement for assurance engagement and non-assurance engagement. So we'll begin with assurance engagement letters. Assurance engagement letters. What is an assurance engagement letter? Candidates, an assurance engagement letter is a written agreement or contract between an assurance provider, such as an auditor or an assurance practitioner, and a client organization. It is a written agreement. It is a written agreement. An assurance engagement letter. Of course, we have two: assurance engagement letter and non-assurance engagement letter. So we begin by defining an assurance engagement letter, and I've said here that it is a written agreement or contract. It is a written agreement or contract. It is a written agreement or contract between the professional assurance professional and the client organization. It is a written agreement or contract between the assurance professional, like an accountant or an auditor or a practitioner, with the client organization, and it outlines the terms. This letter outlines the terms and conditions under which the assurance engagement will be conducted. Terms and conditions. Within this letter, you will find the terms and conditions under which the assurance engagement will be conducted, establishing a clear understanding between both parties regarding the scope, the objectives, and responsibilities of the engagement. So in this lesson, we will outline the elements, the key components or elements, components of an assurance engagement letter. Assurance engagement letter. What are the key components? Number one, this letter has to identify parties. Identification of the parties involved. Identification of the parties involved. That's the first key component. Now, this includes the assurance professional and the client organization. The engagement letter identifies the assurance provider and the client organization, including their respective names, their addresses, and contact details. The parties. What is the name of the assurance provider? What is the name of the client organization? What is the address of the client organization? What are the contact details of the parties? That's the first key component of an assurance engagement. Number 2, objectives and the scope. The objectives and the scope of the assurance engagement. The objectives and the scope of the assurance engagement. Candidates, an assurance engagement letter outlines the purpose and the objectives of the assurance engagement, specifying the specific subject matter to be evaluated. Do you understand? As well as the criteria against which it will be assessed. And the section on objectives and scope also defines the scope of the engagement, which may include limitations and exclusions. Objectives and scope. These are two things. Objectives and the scope. The purpose and objectives of the assurance engagement. This section must specify what is the subject matter. Is it the financial statements that are being is it the financial statement that will be the subject matter, or what will it be? It has to be clear on the objectives in relation to the subject matter that will be evaluated. There has to be also clarity on the criteria upon which the subject matter will be assessed. There also has to be scope. The engagement letter under this section also outlines or defines the scope of engagement, which may include any limitations or any exclusions. Number 3, assurance standards or methodology. Assurance standards or methodology. Now, the engagement letter has to state the assurance standards that will be followed during the engagement, such as the international, this could be, say, the international standards on assurance engagement. International, it could be the international standards on assurance engagement, ISAE. That could be a standard upon which the subject matter may be evaluated, right? Or any other applicable professional standards. And this section mentions the assurance methodologies and techniques that will be applied by the profession. Standards and methodology. I'll give you an example of a standard. Okay? The international standards on auditing engagements. This will be a standard. So that's the third key component of assurance engagement letter. Number 4 is the responsibilities of the assurance provider. Responsibilities of the assurance provider. The responsibilities of the parties. Let me just say the parties, because it has to be the responsibility of the assurance provider and the client, and the responsibilities of the client. There has to be both responsibilities of the parties under this section. Responsibilities. This section clarifies the respective responsibilities of the assurance provider and the client, and it outlines the information and assistance the client is expected to provide, as well as the assurance provider's obligations regarding independence, professional competence, and ethical conduct. Number 5, timelines and schedules for assurance engagement. Within the engagement letter, there has to be timelines and schedules for assurance engagement, specifying important dates, important milestones, and deadlines. This section may also indicate the timing of interim and financial or assurance reports or opinions. When the opinion, for example, interim opinion expected to be given by the professional, or when should the client expect the final opinion. So there has to be timelines and schedules for assurance engagement. The timelines, the engagement, the important dates, the milestones, they have to be specified within this letter. Timelines and schedules. 6, fees and payment terms. Fees and payment terms. This one here, this section addresses the assurance fees and payment terms, including the basis of billing. Will the billing be based on time, or will it be fixed fees? Will it be an hourly rate, or will it be a fixed fees? That's the basis of billing. It has to be indicated in this letter. There ought to also be the payment schedule. When is the assurance provided expected to be paid? Is it at the very end, when after he gives an opinion, or there will be payments in between the period when the assurance provider does his work? And are there any additional costs or expenses to be borne by the client? That has to be specified in the assurance engagement letter. Fees and payment terms. Fees and payment terms. Then there is a section known as confidentiality. Confidentiality. Number 7, confidentiality and access to information. Confidentiality and access to information. This section emphasizes the confidentiality of the client's organization and also specifies any limitations on the disclosure of assurance findings or reports. The section may also establish the assurance provider's rights to access necessary reports or necessary records, to access necessary documentations, or to access personnel within the client organization, because that is the information that the assurance provider needs in order to carry out his or her work. So there has to be a section within this letter on confidentiality. The section emphasizes the confidentiality of a client information, because in the process of carrying out the work, the professional may come across information that is sensitive, that is confidential. So there has to be a clause within the letter which emphasizes that information gathered must be held in confidence. That is number 7. We are discussing the key components of assurance engagement letter. Number 8 is reporting and communication. there is a section within this letter on reporting and communication. The engagement letter outlines the format and content of the assurance report or opinion that will be issued to the client upon completion of the engagement. And it may also describe the process of communicating assurance findings. There may also be need for management letters or other correspondence between the assurance provider and the client. Do you understand? Like, say, at the end of the engagement, there may be need to have, say, a management letter that is written from the professional to the client organization. So there has to be clarity on the format and the content of the assurance report that is expected to be issued to the client upon completion of the engagement. There may also be need to communicate. The assurance expert may also be required to communicate the findings, may be required to write management letters or other correspondence during and after the engagement. So that has to be part of the agreement. Number 9, termination clause. Termination clause. This clause specifies the conditions under which either party can terminate the assurance engagement, including reasons for termination and any notice periods required. Because you said at the beginning, this an assurance engagement, you said, is a contract. It is a contract. And when entering into any contract, there has to be termination clause, because the parties come into an agreement willingly. Then there has to be a termination clause which specifies the conditions under which either party can terminate the assurance engagement. When a clause specifying when either of the parties can terminate the assurance agreement, and this clause should include the reasons for termination. It has to be clear that either of the party, if either of the party would want to terminate the contract, then the party must give reasons for terminating the contract. So it has to be indicated in the contract itself. There ought to be also notice periods, such that a party cannot just wake up any day and terminate the contract. There has to be notice periods from either party of intention or intent to terminate the contract. 10. Governing law and dispute resolution. Governing law and dispute resolution. The engagement letter also identifies the governing law that will apply to the agreement and includes provisions for dispute resolution, such as mediation, such as arbitration, in case of conflicts or disagreements. This is an important element of an assurance engagement letter. So we have discussed the key components of assurance engagement letter. There is the other bit, non-assurance engagement. Non-assurance non-assurance engagement letter. I hope you recall the distinction we made in our last lesson between an assurance engagement and a non-assurance engagement. We made a clear distinction between the two. So we've discussed the key components of an assurance engagement. We now want to move on to the letter that covers the contract between a non-assurance professional and the client. Non-assurance engagement letter. But first of all, what is a non-assurance engagement letter? Now, a non-assurance engagement letter is just like the assurance engagement letter. It is an agreement or contract between a professional service provider and the client organization. It is organization. It is an agreement between a professional service provider or an assurance professional and the client and the client organization for non-assurance service. For non-assurance service. Again, if you may need to refer to our last lesson, we made a distinction between assurance engagement and non-assurance engagement. We went ahead to give examples of both. So a non-assurance engagement letter is a contract between an assurance provider and a client organization for non-assurance service. And unlike assurance engagement, which involves evaluating and providing assurance on specific subject matter, a non-assurance engagement encompasses a broader range of services that do not require providing assurance or expressing an opinion on the outcome. And that is the main distinction between these two engagements. An assurance engagement, the professional is required to provide assurance or express an opinion on the subject matter. But in a non-assurance engagement, the professional is not required to provide assurance or express an opinion on the outcome. So then, what are the key components? Key components, I write the key components right over here. Components. Key components of non-assurance engagement letter. Key components of non-assurance engagement letter, just like in the key components of assurance engagement letter, one is identification of parties. Given that this is also a contract, the letter must identify the parties to the contract. And these are the service provider, the professional, and the client organization, including the respective names, addresses, and contact details. 2. Description of service. Description of service. Description of service or services. The letter outlines the specific non-assurance services to be provided by the service provider. The section also provides a clear description of the nature of the work, the scope of the engagement, and any specific deliverables or outcomes expected. 3. Objectives or purpose. Objectives or purpose. The engagement letter clarifies the objectives and purpose of the non-assurance engagement. It also explains the intended outcomes or benefits that the client organization expects to achieve through the service provided. 4. Responsibilities of the parties. There is also a section on responsibilities of the service provider and the client organization. This section outlines the respective responsibilities of the service provider as well as the responsibilities of the client. It defines the information and cooperation that the client needs to provide, as well as the obligations the service provider in performing the services, the obligations and responsibilities. Number 5, timeline and deadlines. Timeline and deadlines. The engagement letter here includes the expected timeline or schedules for non-assurance engagement. It also specifies the important dates, important milestones, and deadlines, ensuring that both parties have a clear understanding of the timing and expectations. Timeline and deadlines. 6. Fees and payment terms. Fees and payment terms. Fees and payment terms. Fees and payment terms. In this section addresses fees for the non-assurance provider and the payment terms. Fees the provider is expected to be paid, and the terms, under what terms. The section outlines the billing structure, the payment schedule, and any additional costs and terms of payment. That has to be clearly indicated in the agreement. Because many times in business, people disagree on money, on fees. So it's important to have a clear section addressing the question of fees and the payment terms. 7. Confidentiality and privacy. Confidentiality and privacy. This section emphasizes the confidentiality and privacy of the client organization information. It may include a confidentiality clause or a commitment to comply with the relevant data protection regulations, because in the process of carrying out his assignment, the professional may come across information of the client that is deemed to be confidential, and therefore there ought to be a clause within the agreement on protection, on data protection. The professional should not release any confidential information to third parties without approval or knowledge of the client organization. Termination clause. Termination clause. Termination clause. This section specifies the conditions under which either party can terminate the engagement, and this may include reasons for termination, notice periods, and any other associated costs or consequences of termination. Number 9, governing. There has to be a clause on governing law and dispute resolution. Governing law and dispute resolution. The engagement letter should identify the governing law that will apply to the agreement. It should also include provisions for dispute resolution, such as mediation or arbitration in case of conflicts or disagreements between the parties. So that's all we can say about the non-assurance engagement letter, but it's important to note as we close that the non-assurance engagement letter serves as a formal agreement that outlines the terms, the scope, the expectations of non-assurance services to be provided. This letter also helps establish a clear understanding between the service provider and the client, ensuring that both parties are aligned and have agreed upon the scope, they have agreed upon the deliverables, they have agreed upon the associated responsibilities with the engagement. And that marks the end of our today's lesson, where we've discussed two letters. One in relation to assurance engagement, the other one in relation to non-assurance engagement. We've defined both. We've defined an assurance engagement as a letter that is written between, it is a written letter or an agreement between the assurance professional and the client organization. We've identified the key components of assurance engagement letter. One is identification of the parties. Two, objectives and scope. We also say there is a section on assurance standards and methodology. Number 4, responsibilities of the provider and the client. Number 5, timelines and schedules for assurance engagement. Number 6, fees and payment terms. Number 7, confidentiality and access to information. Number 8, reporting and communication. Number 9, termination clause. Number 10, governing law and dispute resolution. We went ahead in this lesson to define a non-assurance engagement letter. We said that a non-assurance engagement letter is an agreement or contract between a professional service provider and a client organization for non-assurance services. Then we outlined the key components of a non-assurance engagement letter. Number 1 being identification of parties. Number 2, description of service. Number 3, objectives and purpose. Number 4, we say there ought to be a section on responsibilities of the parties. Number 5, timeline and deadlines. Number 6, fees and payment terms. Number 7, confidentiality and privacy. Number 8, termination clause. And lastly, governing law and dispute resolution. So candidates, thank you for attending our today's lesson. In our next session, we continue to share knowledge in auditing and assurance. Bye-bye.